The neighborhood had always seemed like the kind of place people dreamed of living in. The streets were clean, the houses were neatly lined up with freshly painted fences, and kids could be seen riding bicycles in the evenings. On the surface, everything looked peaceful and perfect. But hidden beneath the calm surface was the constant tension that came from one person: Karen. She was the type of neighbor who believed she knew best about everything and everyone. She was not elected, nor was she given authority, but in her own mind, she ruled the community. She lived in the largest house near the entrance of the neighborhood, and to her, that gave her a sense of superiority over everyone else. Karen had always been active in the Homeowners Association, but instead of focusing on community improvements, she focused more on control. She would patrol the sidewalks with a notepad in her hand, scribbling down small infractions like grass being half an inch too tall or trash cans left outside for a few hours longer than the rules allowed. She believed these violations made the neighborhood unsafe, and she made it her personal mission to police every corner. Most neighbors found her behavior annoying but chose not to confront her. They didn't want unnecessary drama, and in some ways, it was easier to let her have her little power trip. But Karen wasn't satisfied with writing warning letters or filing complaints with the HOA board. Her behavior escalated when she began forming what she proudly called her security patrol. She recruited a few equally nosy neighbors who liked the idea of having authority, though none of them had any actual training or permission to do what they were doing. They wore matching reflective vests they ordered online, carried flashlights at night, and acted as though they were law enforcement. They would stop teenagers walking home late, question delivery drivers about their presence, and even take photos of parked cars to report later. The sight of Karen strutting down the street in her vest with her little group behind her became almost comical to some neighbors, but to others, it was intimidating. She barked orders with a whistle hanging from her neck, and her favorite phrase was, "This is a private community. You can't just do whatever you want." People began to avoid her, not because they believed she had real authority, but because they didn't want the headache of dealing with her constant accusations. Even guests visiting residents found themselves cornered by Karen's questions. "Who are you here to see? Do you have permission to park here?" It felt less like a neighborhood and more like a gated military base under her watch. Her obsession with security grew stronger with each passing month. She started keeping a log of every incident she thought she saw, even if it was as harmless as kids playing tag near the park or someone jogging after dark. She convinced herself that crime was creeping into the neighborhood, despite the fact that the police had rarely, if ever, been called there for anything serious. But Karen thrived on the idea of danger. It gave her a purpose, a reason to keep acting as though she was the protector of everyone's safety. Some neighbors whispered about her behind closed doors, joking that Karen probably wished she had been a police officer. Others said she watched too many crime shows and was living in her own fantasy. But nobody dared to say these things to her face, because they knew she wouldn't take it lightly. She had a reputation for exploding at anyone who questioned her. Authority. Her patrol began to push limits when she started walking right up to people's properties. At first it was just peeking into yards to check if fences were painted properly, but soon she was stepping onto porches, shining flashlights through windows at night and writing security notes she would tape to front doors. The notes had no legal value, but she signed them with her name followed by Neighborhood Security Chief. People laughed at the title, but at the same time, they felt uneasy. It was one thing to be bossy. It was another to cross the line into people's private space. Taught children in the neighborhood weren't fond of her either. Parents warned them to stay polite, but the kids often whispered about the crazy lady with the notebook. They would scatter if they saw her walking their way, afraid she would accuse them of breaking some made-up rule. Even the local mail carrier found himself at odds with Karen, who once accused him of delivering mail too fast and looking suspicious. Despite all the complaints, Karen seemed unstoppable. The HOA board was small and unmotivated, and most of its members didn't want to deal with the headache of standing up to her. She had a loud voice and could talk over anyone who disagreed, so meetings usually ended with her getting her way. To her, this was proof that she was right. She proudly told people that the neighborhood was safer because of her actions, even though there had been no actual safety issues to begin with. The real problem was that Karen's self-given authority was becoming bolder. Her group of patrol members now roamed the neighborhood almost every night. They carried radios to communicate and acted like they were on serious missions. Karen often led them in drills, where she shouted instructions about how to handle suspicious activity. Neighbors watching from their windows couldn't help but shake their heads at the spectacle. Some joked that she thought she was in a police academy movie, but the laughter always had a nervous edge to it. What if one day she decided to go too far? That fear wasn't unfounded. Karen had already shown that she believed her role allowed her to take action beyond what was reasonable. She once stopped a teenager's car at the entrance of the neighborhood, blocking it with her own vehicle because she thought the driver looked like he didn't belong. The boy was a resident's nephew, and the family was furious, but Karen insisted she was only protecting the community. She had no shame about it and even bragged to her patrol members about how she had stopped a possible intruder. It became clear to many that Karen didn't just want to enforce rules, she wanted to control people. She'd thrived on confrontation, feeding off the fear or frustration of those she challenged. The more people backed down to avoid conflict, the more powerful she felt. And in her mind, there was no limit to her authority. The neighborhood had turned into a place where everyone walked on eggshells, afraid to draw Karen's attention. A car parked slightly crooked could lead to a lecture. A basketball hoop, left near the curb, could result in one of her security notes. And late-night noise, even something as harmless as friends laughing in a backyard, could bring her patrol marching up to demand silence. The once peaceful community was now filled with an unspoken tension. People whispered complaints but rarely acted. Karen had successfully positioned herself as the self-declared enforcer, and she truly believed the neighborhood needed her. But beneath her confidence, there was a dangerous arrogance, the kind that ignored boundaries and dismissed people's rights. Karen didn't realize that her constant meddling was slowly building resentment. Neighbors who once stayed quiet were starting to talk more openly about her behavior. They were tired of being treated like suspects in their own homes. They began sharing stories about her outrageous actions, comparing notes about her patrol's intrusions, and discussing what might happen if she finally crossed the line too far. And though Karen continued her nightly rounds with pride, her whistle blowing and flashlight swinging, she had no idea that her version of security would soon lead her straight into a situation that would expose just how fragile her authority really was. John had been living in the neighborhood for a few years, and unlike many of the other residents, he had no interest in HOA politics or gossip. He was the type of man who minded his own business, kept his house well maintained, and greeted people with a polite smile whenever they crossed paths. He wasn't unfriendly, but he wasn't overly social either. He valued his privacy and peace, and for him, home was a place to relax away from the chaos of the outside world to most people. John seemed like a regular guy in his mid-40s. He was of average height, strong in build, with a calm and steady presence. He worked from home part of the week and commuted the rest of the time, but never made much fuss about what exactly he did. His neighbors knew him as dependable and polite, the type of person who would wave when he drove past, or lend a hand if someone needed help carrying heavy boxes. Beyond that, he kept to himself, and that suited him just fine. What many didn't know was that John had a very unusual and impressive part of his life that he kept private. For years, he had been deeply involved in fitness and tactical training. He wasn't a police officer or a soldier himself, but he was skilled in martial arts, physical conditioning, and strategy. He had a reputation in law enforcement circles for being one of the best civilian trainers in the area. The local SWAT team often came to him for specialized workouts, obstacle drills, and mental focus training. John had earned their respect not because of a badge or a uniform, but because of his expertise, discipline, and the way he carried himself. Whenever he trained SWAT officers, he was professional and serious. He saw him as a mentor, someone who could push them to their limits, but also teach them how to think clearly under pressure. His garage and backyard were set up like a mini training ground, weights, punching bags, climbing ropes, and obstacle courses. To an outsider, it might have just looked like the hobby of a fitness enthusiast, but to those who knew, It was a place where real tactical lessons were practiced. Despite his skills and connections, John never flaunted what he did. He wasn't the kind of man to boast about knowing law enforcement officers or having special training. He liked the quiet, ordinary rhythm of his neighborhood life. He enjoyed cooking meals with his wife, playing catch with his son in the yard, and sitting on the porch in the evenings with a cup of coffee. His sense of strength came from within, not from needing others to recognize it. But while John lived peacefully, he wasn't blind to the drama happening in the neighborhood. He knew about Karen and her so-called security patrol. He had seen them walking around in their reflective vests, stopping people on the street as if they were police officers. Sometimes he watched quietly from his porch as Karen barked at teenagers for riding their bikes too fast. Question delivery. Drivers who were simply doing their jobs. He never interfered because he believed most situations didn't need his involvement. His philosophy was simple. As long as they stayed out of his way, in his family's way, he wouldn't make it his problem. Still, there were moments when he shook his head at Karen's behavior. He could see how her actions made people uneasy. How parents pulled their kids inside when her patrol passed by. How neighbors avoided walking their dogs at certain times just to steer clear of confrontation. John wasn't easily annoyed, but he disliked people who abused power, even if that power was only imagined. To him, true strength was quiet and controlled, not loud and bossy. Watching Karen parade around like she owned the streets was almost laughable to him, but he also knew it was only a matter of time before she went too far. John's wife often asked him why he didn't step in or say something at the HOA meetings when Karen dominated the conversations. He would smile and tell her because sometimes the best thing you can do is let people dig their own hole. He knew from experience that people like Karen, who thrived on control and attention, always pushed too far eventually. And when they did, their own actions brought them down. For John, life was about balance. He trained to lead officers in high-intensity situations, but at home, he wanted calm. He believed in protecting his family, not by making loud declarations, but by being prepared in quiet ways. He had taught his wife and son basic self-defense, kept his home secure, maintained close ties with the law enforcement community, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. He didn't need to advertise it to anyone in the neighborhood, because he wasn't trying to prove anything. Some of his closest friends were the very SWAT officers who trusted him with their training. They often dropped by his house, sometimes in uniform, sometimes just in casual clothes, and they would laugh together in the backyard after a grueling workout. A few neighbors noticed the visits, but nobody thought much of it. To them, they were just John's friends stopping by for exercise. Nobody could have guessed how deep the respect and trust between John and those officers ran. It was this quiet strength that made John different from Karen. While she shouted for attention, wearing her vest and blowing her whistle, John didn't need to make a show of his abilities. He had nothing to prove. He was confident in his skills, his friendships, and his ability to handle himself in any situation. In fact, Karen barely paid attention to John at all. In her mind, he was just another resident who stayed out of her way. She thought of him as harmless, the type who wouldn't argue if she ever confronted him about a rule violation. She didn't know, and couldn't have imagined, that the quiet man who waved politely while mowing his lawn was someone who trained some of the most skilled officers in the city. To her, John was invisible in the bigger picture of her authority. But John noticed her more than she realized. He didn't dislike her personally, but he disliked what she represented: arrogance, control, and lack of respect for others. He was patient, but he had limits. He wasn't the type to invite conflict, but he wasn't the type to back down if it came to his door either. His calm nature hid a sharp readiness, one that Karen would never recognize until it was too late. His son once asked him why he didn't stop the lady with the whistle from bossing everyone around. John ruffled his boy's hair and said, "Because, son, sometimes people need to see for themselves who someone really is. When the time comes, she'll show everyone." His words carried a quiet certainty, the kind that came from years of observing human behavior, both in training and in real life. In his heart, John hoped it wouldn't come to that. He hoped Karen would stay in her lane, and that the neighborhood would return to the peaceful place it was supposed to be. But he also knew better than to ignore the warning signs. He had trained too many officers about escalation to miss the obvious truth. When someone with no real authority plays at being in charge, eventually they push into dangerous territory. And when that happened, it wouldn't just be irritating, it could be serious. For now, though, John carried on with his simple, steady routine. He worked, he trained, he cared for his family, and he stayed polite with his neighbors. He enjoyed his quiet life, never revealing just how prepared he truly was. To the outside world, he was just John, the easygoing man next door. But beneath that calm exterior lived a man of discipline, strength, and a network of allies that no one, especially Karen, could ever have imagined. It was a quiet evening when everything began to unravel. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the neighborhood bathed in soft orange and purple light. Most families were settling down for dinner or relaxing in their living rooms. John and his family were no different. His wife was preparing food in the kitchen. His son was sprawled on the couch playing a video game. And John himself was reading quietly in his study. It was the kind of calm evening that reminded him why he loved his home so much. But that peace wasn't going to last. On the other side of the neighborhood, Karen was pacing like a hawk. She had been restless all day, convinced that something suspicious was going on at John's house. She had seen a delivery van parked outside earlier in the afternoon and decided it looked out of place. In reality, it was just a package drop-off, but in her mind, it was evidence that something strange was happening. She told her patrol that she had a bad feeling and that it was their duty to check on the situation. Her little group, always eager to follow her lead, agreed without much thought. By nightfall, Karen had worked herself into a frenzy. She told her patrol that she suspected John might be hiding something dangerous, maybe even criminal. The words were absurd, but spoken with her usual certainty, they sounded convincing enough to her followers. Fueled by her imagination and her need to feel important, Karen made the reckless decision that would change everything. She was going to investigate John's house herself. She didn't knock on the door. She didn't call the police. Instead, she marched straight to his yard with her patrol trailing behind. Her flashlight beam cut through the evening shadows, scanning John's windows as if she were a real officer on duty. When she reached his front porch, she jiggled the doorknob, expecting it to be locked. To her surprise, the door wasn't latched all the way. John's son had gone out to the garage earlier and hadn't closed it firmly. That small mistake gave Karen all the excuse she needed. Without hesitation, she pushed the door open and stormed inside, shouting, "Neighborhood security, open up. We're here to check things out." The sound of her voice echoed through the hallway, startling John's family. His wife dropped a spoon onto the kitchen counter. His son sat up straight on the couch, and John himself froze for a moment, confused by the intrusion. Within seconds, he rose from his chair and walked into the living room to find Karen standing. Inside his home, flanked by two members of her so-called patrol, John's eyes narrowed slightly. His calm demeanor didn't change. But the sight of strangers barging into his home without permission stirred something sharp inside him. His wife looked frightened, and his son was wide-eyed with shock. Karen, however, looked triumphant, pointed her flashlight toward John, and announced loudly, "We've had reports of suspicious activity here. I need to make sure everything is in order." John took a slow step forward, his voice steady but firm. "Karen, you are in my house without permission. You need to leave right now." But Karen wasn't listening. She had convinced herself that she was in the right. "If you've got nothing to hide, then you shouldn't mind us checking around. This is for the safety of the neighborhood," she said, her voice carrying a false authority that made his wife flinch. John's son, frightened by the intrusion, whispered, "Dad, why are they in here?" That one small question hit John harder than anything Karen had said. This wasn't just about annoyance anymore. This was about his family's safety and the fear being forced into his son's voice. John held out a hand, a quiet gesture for his son to stay calm, and then looked directly at Karen. "You need to leave now. You don't have the right to be here. This is trespassing." Still, Karen pushed forward, her patrol nervously following behind. She opened a closet door as if searching for hidden secrets, then peered into the kitchen, completely ignoring John's words. To her, this was her moment of power, her chance to prove she was the protector of the neighborhood. Her patrol looked uncomfortable, but Karen's confidence kept them moving. The tension in the house grew heavier with each second. John's wife tried to reason with Karen. You can't just barge into people's homes. This isn't your job. Please, leave before this gets worse. But Karen brushed her off. If you're innocent, then you have nothing to worry about, she replied smugly, as though she were repeating a line from a television cop drama. John's patience was thinning. He wasn't the kind of man to lose his temper easily, but he had spent years teaching SWAT officers how quickly a situation could escalate if someone didn't take control. Right now, his instincts told him that Karen wasn't going to stop until someone made her stop. His voice dropped lower, sharper, as he said, "Karen, this ends now. Step outside." His tone made her pause for the first time. There was a weight in his words that even she felt. But rather than backing down, she doubled down, glaring at him and saying, "You can't tell me what to do. I'm in charge of neighborhood security. I'll leave when I'm satisfied this house is safe." That final declaration nearly made John laugh from the absurdity of it, but the seriousness of the moment kept his expression stern. His son's frightened eyes, his wife's tense posture, and the violation of their home made it clear this was no longer just neighborhood drama. Karen had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. The patrol members behind her shifted uneasily, their confidence wavering. One of them muttered, "Karen, maybe we should go." But she silenced him with a sharp look. She was too deep into her fantasy of authority to retreat now. John stood tall, his arms crossed, his calm face hiding the storm brewing beneath. He wasn't going to lay a hand on her. He didn't need to, but he was ready, his mind already running through options, in case she refused to leave. His years of training had prepared him for moments just like this. Moments when control of a situation had to be taken without escalating it into chaos. The air in the room was thick with tension. Karen had no idea how close she was to pushing. John passed the line of patience. She thought she was the one in control. But she was standing in the home of a man who had taught elite officers how to disarm, strain, and neutralize threats far greater than her. The only reason she was still standing there unchecked was because John valued restraint more than power. But even restraint had its limits, and Karen was about to learn just how far she had gone. The air inside the house was tense, and Karen stood in the middle of the living room as if she owned the place. Her patrol members shifted nervously, clearly starting to regret following her this far. John's wife held her son close, whispering for him to stay calm, but her eyes never left Karen. John himself stood steady, his face unreadable, though deep inside he was calculating every move and every word. Then, just as the standoff seemed like it would boil over, there was a knock. At the door, quick and firm, before anyone could answer, the door opened, and in stepped Mike. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen and handled countless high-stress situations. To anyone else he might have looked like just a friend coming by, but to John, he was more than that. He was a trusted SWAT officer. Someone who had trained with him countless times. Someone who knew how to read a room in seconds. Mike was supposed to be there that evening. For a regular workout session, he had his gym bag slung over his shoulder. But the moment he stepped inside and saw the scene unfolding, his entire demeanor shifted. His eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of Karen and her patrol standing inside John's home without permission. The tension in the air was thick, but Mike's voice cut through it with sharp clarity. "What's going on here?" Karen spun around, startled but quickly trying to recover her confidence. She puffed out her chest and snapped, "This is neighborhood security business. We're making sure everything is safe in this house." Set his bag down slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. "Safe by breaking into someone's home? Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Karen hesitated, then straightened her shoulders, trying to sound in control. "I don't need your opinion. I'm the head of neighborhood security. This family has been acting suspicious, and we're doing our duty to check things out." Stepped closer, and though he didn't raise his voice, His presence alone filled the room. "You're not law enforcement. You're not security. You are trespassing, and you just committed breaking and entering. That's a serious crime." Color drained from the faces of the two patrol members standing behind Karen. One of them stammered, "Breaking and entering? That's illegal?" Karen turned to silence them, her face flushed with frustration. "Don't listen to him. He's just trying to scare us." She turned back to Mike defiantly. "And who exactly do you think you are, barging in here and talking like you're in charge?" For a moment, the room went completely still. John's wife held her breath. John himself stood silently watching. And the patrol members looked back and forth nervously like they were witnessing something far bigger than they'd signed up for. Mike reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. With a smooth motion, he flipped it open, revealing his badge. His voice was sharp and commanding as he said, "I'm a SWAT officer. And if you don't step outside right now, you'll be leaving this house in handcuffs." The effect was immediate. Karen froze, her face pale as her eyes locked on the badge. The patrol members behind her looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. They exchanged nervous glances, clearly realizing just how deep into trouble they had wandered. Karen tried to regain her footing, but her voice trembled. That can't be real. You're bluffing." "The HOA gave me authority." Mike cut her off, his tone sharper now. "The HOA doesn't give anyone the right to break into private property. You are not above the law. Right now, you're seconds away from being arrested. Do you want me to make that call?" Karen opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She glanced back at her patrol for support, but they both stepped away from her, shaking their heads. One of them muttered, "We didn't sign up for this, Karen. We thought this was just watching the neighborhood." The silence in the room pressed in like a weight. John stood beside Mike now, not saying a word but making it clear where he stood. His calm expression contrasted with Karen's panicked face. The balance of power had shifted entirely, and for the first time, Karen realized she wasn't the one in control. Mike's voice softened slightly, though it still carried the weight of authority. "I don't want to escalate this any further. You're going to walk out that door, and you're going to think very carefully about what you've done. Because next time, I won't stop at a warning. Do you understand?" Karen swallowed hard, her arrogance crumbling. She wanted to argue, to cling to her imagined authority, but the badge in front of her left no room for denial. Her hands shook slightly as she muttered, "Fine, we'll go." She turned on her heel and stomped toward the door, her pride wounded but her options gone. The two patrol members followed quickly, eager to get out of the mess they had found themselves in. As they stepped out into the night, the air inside the house finally felt lighter. Mike closed the door behind them and locked it firmly before turning back to John and his family. His expression softened as he looked at John's wife and son. "Are you both okay?" he asked gently. John's wife nodded, though she was still shaken. "Thank you," she whispered. Her relief cleared. John placed a hand on his son's shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. Then he turned to Mike, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good timing, as always," Mike let out, a short chuckle, shaking his head. "You weren't kidding about this neighborhood being wild. That woman is dangerous, John. She thinks she's untouchable." John's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful look. "She's been building up to this for a while. Tonight, she crossed the line. I don't think she realizes how serious this is yet." Mike nodded. "Oh, she'll realize it soon enough. And if she doesn't, the law will make her." The two men shared a quiet moment of understanding. For John, it wasn't about revenge or teaching Karen a lesson. It was about protecting his family and making sure no one ever threatened the safety of his home again. For Mike, it was about upholding the law and ensuring that people like Karen understood there were consequences for reckless behavior. Outside, Karen's patrol members were already whispering to each other, shaken by what had just happened. Their loyalty to her had cracked completely. They had followed her because they liked the feeling of being important. But now, they realized they had been dragged into something dangerous and illegal. One of them muttered, "I'm done with this. Can play cop on our own." Karen, however, walked stiffly down the sidewalk, her pride burning hotter than ever. She had just been humiliated, exposed as powerless in front of everyone she wanted to impress. Deep inside, she knew Mike's words were true, but her stubbornness refused to admit it. For now, though, she had no choice but to retreat. Inside the house, John hugged his wife and son tightly, silently promising himself that he would never let fear enter their home again. Mike stood nearby, watching the family with quiet respect. He knew his friend didn't need rescuing. John was more than capable of handling himself, but he was glad he had arrived when he did. Sometimes even the strongest men needed someone to stand beside them. The night slowly returned to calm, but the events had left a mark. Karen had been forced out, her power shattered by the simple truth of real authority standing in front of her. And though she had walked away, everyone knew this wasn't over. For the first time, Karen had been shown her limits. And for the first time, the neighborhood had seen that beneath her noise and bluster. She wasn't nearly as strong as she wanted everyone to believe. The neighborhood was buzzing the very next morning, news traveled fast, and by sunrise, almost everyone had heard some version of the story. Some said Karen had been dragged out of John's house by the police. Others claimed she had been arrested on the spot, and a few exaggerated even further, saying there had been a standoff. The truth wasn't quite as dramatic, but it was serious enough to shake the entire community. What actually happened was enough to make people see Karen in a way they never had before, not as a strict rule enforcer, but as someone who had finally gone too far. Karen herself woke up with a heavy feeling in her chest. She hated how the night had ended. For years she had strutted around the neighborhood, demanding respect, lecturing others, and controlling as much as she could. But when Mike revealed his badge and called out her actions for what they really were, everything inside her had collapsed. She had walked away, but the humiliation stuck like glue. The patrol members she once treated like her loyal soldiers now wanted nothing to do with her. One had even sent her a message that morning saying, "I quit. Don't involve me in your security stuff again." The HOA board couldn't ignore what had happened either. Several neighbors, including John's wife, had filed formal complaints. Overnight, people who had been too afraid to speak up in the past now came forward, sharing stories about how Karen had trespassed onto their property, shined flashlights into their windows, or left threatening notes. Suddenly, there was a pile of evidence proving that her so-called security patrol wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. By noon, the HOA called an emergency meeting. Karen showed up, still trying to act confident, but it was obvious she was. Shaken, instead of applause or support, she was met with cold stares from nearly every resident in the room. The president of the board cleared his throat and said, "Karen, we've received multiple complaints. What happened last night at John's house was unacceptable. You and your patrol have crossed the line." Karen tried to defend herself. "Was protecting the neighborhood. I saw suspicious activity and I acted. If anything, you should be thanking me." But the room erupted with voices. "Protecting us? You scared my kids," one woman shouted. "You barged onto my porch at midnight last month," another added. "You blocked my nephew's car in the driveway," a man yelled. For years, people had swallowed their frustrations, but now the dam had burst. One by one, they piled on, telling their stories, their anger, and their fear. Karen's face turned red as she realized she was alone. The board didn't take long to make a decision, effective immediately. "You are removed from any HOA activities." The president declared firmly, "Your so-called security patrol is banned. If you or anyone acting on your behalf harasses or trespasses again, we will involve the police." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, she was powerless. She sat back in her chair, trembling with rage and embarrassment. As the entire neighborhood watched her authority crumble into dust, meanwhile, John kept quiet during the meeting. He didn't need to say much. The truth had already spoken for itself. He sat in the back with his arms crossed, listening as the residents finally found the courage to stand up. His wife squeezed his hand, proud of how he had handled everything. His son, still a little shaken, whispered, "Dad, does this mean she won't come back to our house?" John smiled softly and said, "No, son, she won't. Followed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. People seemed lighter, freer, as if a weight had been lifted. Children played outside without fear of being scolded. Delivery drivers no longer had to face interrogation at the gate. Neighbors chatted more openly, some even laughing about how ridiculous Karen had looked in her reflective vest with her whistle. What had once been a quiet tension was now replaced with relief. Karen, however, withdrew from sight. Patrolled the streets or held her notebook. She stayed inside her big house at the entrance of the neighborhood, her curtains drawn. The once loud woman who had controlled everyone with her booming voice had been silenced. Some neighbors pitied her, others were simply glad she was gone. She had built her world on control, and once that control was taken away, she had nothing left to stand on. But the incident also left behind an unspoken respect for John, though he never bragged about what had happened. People began to see him differently. Neighbors who had once only waved politely now stopped to chat. Some even came by to thank him for standing his ground. "You kept your cool," one man said. "Anyone else would have blown up, but you stayed calm. That's real strength." John would only smile modestly and say, "I just did what I had to do." His connection to Mike and the SWAT team eventually became known, though not because John told anyone. Word spread after one of the patrol members mentioned it nervously. 2 others, and soon the story was out. People were stunned to realize that the quiet man who kept to himself was the same man who trained elite officers. It added a layer of respect and even awe. No one had suspected it. And that made the whole situation even more satisfying to those who had suffered under Karen's rule. Children in the neighborhood began to look up to John as well. They admired how he had stood calmly when Karen tried to take over his home. Some even joked, "He's like a superhero in disguise." John laughed at that, but he appreciated the thought. More importantly, his own son looked at him with newfound pride. That night, when things had gone wrong, his son had seen with his own eyes what true strength looked like, not shouting, not threatening, but steady and controlled. The HOA eventually put new rules in place, ensuring that nothing like Karen's patrol could ever happen again. They introduced clearer guidelines, stricter limits on individual authority, and a better system for reporting issues. This time, the community was more united. Determined never to let one person dominate everyone else again, Karen remained a cautionary tale. Her fall from power was discussed for months. New residents were warned about her story, told with a shake of the head and a laugh. "Don't get too power-hungry," people would say. "Remember what happened to Karen?" For John, life slowly returned to the quiet rhythm he loved. His evenings were peaceful again, his wife felt safe, and his son played freely without worry. Mike still came by regularly, and the two continued their training sessions, often laughing about the absurdity of that night. "Out of all the houses in the city, she picked yours," Mike joked once. "If she only knew who she was walking into," John chuckled and replied, "That's the thing about people like her. They never stop to think. They just act." And he was right. Karen had acted without thought, blinded by her need for control, and in doing so, she had destroyed the little authority she imagined she had. The neighborhood moved on, stronger and closer than before. And in the end, Karen's downfall taught everyone a simple but lasting lesson. Real authority doesn't come from whistles, vests, or loud voices. It comes from respect, discipline, and the ability to protect others without needing to shout about it. For John, he never needed to prove himself to anyone. His quiet strength spoke louder than Karen's whistle ever could. And his family's safety was all the proof he needed that he had done the right thing.